Still people coming in. Good evening and welcome to the 6th event in Grebel's 9-week series on Mennonites writing, mostly of the past 50 years and mostly in Canada. My name is Hildy Fraze-Thiessen. Tonight we diverge from the Russian Mennonites with roots in Western Canada to hear from an American with Amish, that is Swiss roots, from the eastern United States. Tonight is only one of a few public events featuring Julia Spiker Kasdorf and her work, since she is on campus for several days as the 2012 Rod and Lorna Sawatsky Visiting Scholar. And I'd like to thank Lorna Sawatsky, who is here, and the Sawatsky Fund for sponsoring the several Kasdorf events of this week. Julia will be offering 2 poetry workshops tomorrow. Many of you have heard me mention them. There's a little sign-up sheet in the back if anybody's interested. That's Thursday. Poets and would-be poets are welcome to attend from 10 to 12 in the morning or the afternoon 2 to 4. On Friday at 12:30 noon in the college boardroom, in a 1-hour faculty forum session open to everyone, Julia will offer comments on her new book of poetry and speculate on the old identity question, that is, what happens when we use the term Mennonite as a modifier in a literary setting. Among other things, she'll invite us to speculate on how that issue of Mennonite identity might evoke different responses in Canada and the US. On Friday evening, February 17th, she will deliver the Sawatsky Lecture entitled Mightier Than the Sword, Martyr's Mirror in the New World, with a reception to follow. The venue has been announced as the chapel, but as I mentioned last week, Friday's lecture will take place in the Great Hall at 7:30, and we hope to see you there. Before we proceed to the heart of the evening, I would like, as is my wont, to introduce you to our next guest in this series, the novelist David Bergen. If literary awards and prizes were medals, one would describe David Bergen as supremely decorated. From the very first stories he published, which were selected for the prestigious Journey Prize anthologies, to his most recent work, a novel entitled The Matter with Morris, 2010, Bergen's fiction unfailingly draws national attention, and deservedly so. His first novel, A Year of Lesser, 1996, was a New York Times notable book and winner of the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award. His 2002 novel, The Case of Lena Esk, was a finalist for the Governor General's Award and won the Carol Shields Winnipeg Book Award. It was also finalist for the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award and the Margaret Lawrence Award for Fiction. His 2005 novel, The Time in Between, won the Giller Prize, and his 2008 novel, The Retreat, was long-listed for the Giller Prize. It won the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award and the Margaret Lawrence Award for Fiction. In 2010, his most recent novel, The Matter with Morris, was shortlisted for the Giller as well. David Bergen, like Rudy Wiebe and others, has resisted being referred to as a Mennonite writer, at least insofar as any such designation might entrap him. The forces that he draws from and that cross in his work are multiple and complex. He is above all among the very finest of Canada's writers. He is also a gracious person and an engaging performer who will walk us through his career so far. I'm more than delighted that he agreed to participate in this series, and that I'll have the pleasure of introducing him to you in our next session, which is 2 weeks from tonight, because next week is reading week. And tonight, Conrad Grebel University College is not strange to Julia Spiker Kasdorf, who made her inaugural trip to Waterloo in the spring of 1990 to attend the first of the international conferences on Mennonites writing, which is organized and sponsored here at Grebel by the University of Waterloo's literary magazine, The New Quarterly. Julia, a 20-something poet then, was on assignment for Festival Quarterly, the American Mennonite cultural magazine that was published in Pennsylvania then by Merle and Phyllis Good. These conferences on Mennonites writing, the sixth of which will take place in about 6 weeks from now at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, have been rich meeting places for writers and critics alike. And Julia, at the conference here in Waterloo in 1990, met, among others, Rudy Wiebe, who was then about twice her age, and with him formed a compelling literary friendship, which has culminated in, among other things, their collaboration on poetic translations of some Anabaptist hymns from the Ausbund. The literary friendship between Julia and Rudy Wiebe culminated also in at least one of Julia's poems, one which offers some insight, perhaps, into literary friendship and what writers call the literary process, the mysterious and complex way in which works of literature come to be. Writers presumably talk shop sometimes when they correspond with each other. And in one instance, Rudy had written to Julia about the fact that with the new computer technology, this was several years ago, his copy editor had been able to isolate some dozen or so words that appeared most frequently in his work. Anyone who knows a lot about Wiebe would assume that these words would be extraordinarily weighty words like inexorable, jutting, indiscernible, obscure, and relentless. And indeed, they were these words like this, that Rudy's editor had identified. In the presumably playful exchange that followed Rudy's confession, you realize all of this is hearsay because I wasn't party to the exchange. Julia proposed that she would use all the words that Rudy's editor had isolated and publish them in one poem. And she did. And maybe we can persuade her to read that later if she hasn't decided to. It's called Brooklyn Bridge Showing Painters on Suspenders, 1914. And she produced it to honor Rudy's 60th birthday. The poem was first published in the Indiana Review and then in her second collection of poems, Eve's Striptease. Julia Kasdorf grew up in western Pennsylvania and was educated at Goshen College and New York University, where in 1997 she completed advanced studies in creative writing and English education. She's published 3 volumes of poetry: Sleeping Preacher in 1992, Eve's Striptease in 1998, and Poetry in America, 2011. In 2002, Pandora Press US published her revised dissertation entitled Fixing Tradition, a study of the life of Joseph W. Yoder, who lived from 1872 to 1956. Yoder was author of Rosanna of the Amish, a 1940 work we would now designate as creative nonfiction, a semi-fictionalized biography that, as one commentator has remarked, gives an unusually clear and accurate picture of the brighter side of Amish life and culture. By the turn of the century, Rosanna, undoubtedly the first Mennonite bestseller, had sold some 425,000 copies. In the preface to her study of Yoder's life, Julia remarked that she had come to Yoder as a poet and writer, believing at first that he could show her how a person can become an author and also remain part of the Mennonite community. How a person born into a minority culture might become an artist without breaking ties with his place and people of origin. In 2008, Julia co-edited a new edition of Rosanna of the Amish, Yoder's still popular American text. Julia Kasdorf's poems and essays have been published widely in both literary journals and anthologies, and they have been heard with regularity on Garrison Keillor's Writer's Almanac and other media broadcasts. She's published numerous essays, articles, and reviews, has given many lectures and conference presentations, as well as performed scores of poetry readings. In her Preparatory Remarks in 2001 to a collection of her essays entitled The Body and the Book, Writing from a Mennonite Life, Julia observed that she was in that volume, and I quote, concerned with the relationships between cultural tradition and innovation, collective history and individual memory, sectarian refusals and cosmopolitan desires. She went on, and I quote, "I seek to honor my distinctive Mennonite heritage even as I transgress and transcend its limits," end quote. Julia Spiker Kasdorf's audience is by no means circumscribed by the Mennonite community, yet she speaks forcefully to us. Her work, which documents lyrically and poignantly swaths of the world as she has observed it, richly objectifies all of our own worlds for us. That's one of the reasons we're eager to hear from her. She will take questions after her presentation and has copies of Poetry in America, her latest volume, to sell and sign. And I'm delighted to invite her to come to speak to us, Julia.
It's always very hard to get up after Hildy's introductions. And it's also quite amazing to look out and see Lawrence and Marilyn Martin. Lawrence was my Sunday school teacher at Scottsdale Mennonite Church. Paul and Kathy Van Aragon from Messiah College. Carol Ann. Yep, here we have Scottsdale. I mean, it's quite amazing. I feel like I'm not talking to and Anna Bowman, my women's studies professor from Goshen, I'm not talking to strangers at all, so that will keep me honest. And I want to say something about this amazing thing that Hildy is doing. I was thinking about it on the way up here today, and I had to I remembered this. A kind of miraculous thing happened when my first book won a prize, a publication prize. That in itself was pretty miraculous. But then I got a phone call in my apartment in Brooklyn, New York, and the voice on the other end was that kind of, a person with that kind of elocution that comes from nowhere but money. You know, that's sort of like the way people talked in movies from the 1940s. And it turned out it was the poetry editor from The New Yorker. And she said that my editor had sent the manuscript on to her and she was purchasing 4 of the poems. So I was shocked. That was followed shortly after that. The editors changed at the magazine, and Tina Brown came in from London, who was a big maker of celebrities, and suddenly the taste changed. And I never appeared in the magazine again. But what Tina did, and this is what makes me think of Hildy, when she came to assume the role, she threw this enormous party in a big old hotel on the west side of Manhattan and invited all the writers who were publishing. And it was this glittery affair with great trays of champagne that waiters in black tie were carrying around. And it was something like the likes of something I had never seen before. And I was sitting at this little table with William Matthews, American poet who's no longer living now. And he said, you know, tonight Tina is the bride and we are all her grooms. So for 9 weeks, you have it. I'm going to begin by, so I'm really taking this very literally, the assignment here, to give a tour of my writing career. And I'm going to try to illustrate this autobiographical, I've never done a thing like this, but it's sort of an autobiographical narrative illustrated with poems. So I'm going to begin by reading what I think is the oldest poem that's published in a book of mine, and I wrote this poem in my 3rd year at university. Knees. Every spring I split a knee. Mom said, you'll never be a majorette with knees like that. Sit still. I squirmed, picked scabs. Every day at least peeled the crust to see if it was clean and pink. or watched it bleed, slowly, like a bloom opening, then the thick red petal sliding down my shin until it was stopped by a finger or tongue. Now knees seldom bleed. They just work under hose or jeans, and I laugh at men who look. Knees, just gristle on bone, and there are scars on these. Now, what's alarming about this is I look at this little poem and I see everything that I'm still doing in my work. We have essentially what feels like a narrative. It feels like it's telling a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, but it also acts like a lyric. And typically, like when I teach poetry, I say, well, narrative is a story, it takes place in time. Lyric freezes time. It's that sort of burst of exclamation, ecstasy, when you feel like you're outside of time. But this poem is trying to both tell a story and capture a moment, and that I realize has been something that I've been working with in the space between those two for a long time. I also see an injured body. I see resilience and the insistence on healing. I see a voice of authority scolding. Sit still. And I see disobedience and resistance, and refusals to be fixed by the male gaze. I also see work. Work comes up again and again. So, and I also see using up one's everyday experience as the subject for work. The immediate object is always the adequate symbol. I think it was Ezra Pound who said that. So I'm looking at this and thinking, you know, the more you change, the more you remain the same. So what happened with that poem, I took it, so I'd gone to Goshen for 2 years, and probably because I took Anna's course so early in my career that I had no reason to stick around. So I had Anna and I had Nick Lindsay my freshman year, and what was the point, right? So I transferred to NYU, and I really had not gone to New York before then, and I lived in a Mennonite boarding house, Menno House. Took this workshop. The first day of workshop, I presented this poem, and the teacher didn't say a whole lot except praise, and there weren't many books on the reading list, so I dropped the course. Because I thought, well, you know, like the Victorian novel, you read a whole lot more. And it seemed like you'd be getting your money's worth in a course like that. And that sort of audacity of the country bumpkin and the arrogance of that gesture, and also doing everything the hard way, were things that would follow throughout my career as a writer. But weirdly, sometimes those impulses reward you. And the professor saw that I dropped the class and called me up and said, why did you drop the class? And I told him what I just told you. And he said, well then, I'm running this little workshop in my apartment. Would you like to be part of that? Okay, that sounds like something to beware of. And I didn't have a lot of money. I was watering plants in office buildings 2 days a week as a student. But I tried it, and this guy, Philip Schultz, he won the Pulitzer Prize in 2008. I haven't been in touch with him since, but it was an important step and risk, becoming a writer, because I really did have this idea that you had to go to New York to be a writer. It's not true, but it seemed true at the time. Before I move on, I want to read. I think another reason I dropped that class is because this guy seemed so ordinary after studying with Nick Lindsay at Goshen. Nick really, what I learned from Nick, and I have continued to carry and value, is that Nick is a bard. He believes in the power of song. He believes in a kind of political imperative. I mean, political in the sense of power, having to do with power. Poetry should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. That's Nick. And to be a poet, you need to understand how myth works. And so I want to read what I think is a very Nick Lindsay sort of poem from Eve's Striptease. It's very much in that lyric frozen moment mode, and sort of crazy song-like. Onion, fruit of grace. Onion, fruit of grace, you swell in the garden, hidden as the heart of God, but you are not about religion. Onion, frying into all those O's, you are a perfect poet, and you are not about that. Onion, I love you. You sleek auburn beauty, you break my heart, though I know you don't mean to make me cry. Peeling your paper skin, I cry. Chopping you, I cry. Slicing off your wiry roots, I cry like a penitent at communion. Onion, tasting grace layer by layer, I eat your sweet heart that burns like the Savior's. The sun crust you pull on while you're still underground, I've peeled it, onion. I'm eating God's tears. The thing that Nick taught us too is that not only is poetry about truth and beauty, but many times truth is unbearable. And those are things that I think I thought he was crazy when I studied with him. He chanted. He was very interested in the bicameral mind when I studied with him, and so he would just come in and chant at us because he thought that would go to that other place in your head. Two, what is two? And, as a sort of practical kid from a Swiss Mennonite background, I thought he was nuts. But I realize now how lucky I was. Before Goshen, I lived in, as Hildy said, Western Pennsylvania, not in Scottdale, about 25 miles away from the Mennonite community there. And my mother grew up in a conservative conference Mennonite home in the 1950s, pretty orderly, kind of buttoned up family. And my father grew up in an Amish home in the same community. And so in many ways, I think now, looking back on it, although their ancestors, they were related, of course, although their ancestors came to Pennsylvania in the 1730s and 40s, it was as if they were the immigrants in a certain way. They were the ones who left their home community and moved out into the world and got an education. And it wasn't something we talked about much, but we just sort of lived between these two very different worlds. How my father learned English. Breathing his own breath, forehead pressed in a corner, while the teacher's syllables pelted his back, meaningless. At some point, he says, it just began to make sense. Sounds gave up significance as neatly as the clear and yolk slipped into batter when his mother tapped a bowl and pulled eggshells apart. How could she bear to think of her first grader, mute and confused, the long season from Labor Day to Christmas, begging translation from desk mates, pestering hired men for names of things during chores? She knew he'd eventually piece together a tongue with words from home and school. Only this fall, I think, to ask how that happened, though I've taught English for years, eagerly asking the foreigners to tell me about their homes. Please, I urge, say it in English. So I attended public schools there. I was the only Mennonite, typically in classes of children who were the children or grandchildren of Italian Americans, of Eastern European immigrants who had come to that part of the country to work in the coal and steel industries. I went to some pretty bad schools. I would say they were bad schools, but I had some good teachers, a few. And I learned that we don't always get to choose to live with people who are like us. And that was a pretty good lesson. I also learned the sectarian way of defining oneself in opposition to others. Catholics. In 3rd grade, all the girls got confirmed and had their ears pierced. They flaunted those dingy threads that hung from their lobes, telling how the ice stung, how the cartilage crunched when the needle broke through, how knots in the thread had to be pulled through the holes, one each day, like a prayer on the rosary. At recess, I turned the rope while Michelle skipped and spun and counted to 10, and a scapular leapt from the neck of her dress. She dangled that pale pink ribbon, a picture of the Blessed Mother on one end and the Sacred Heart on the other, saying, "This is my protection, front and back." That was when I called them Catholic and said, "Your people killed my people. Your priest threw a man into a river tied in a sack with a dog, a cat, a rooster, a snake. Think how they scratched and bit going down. Think how they drowned. Your priest burned holes in the tongues of our preachers and put pacifists naked in cages to starve and rot while the birds pecked off their flesh." Michelle and Vicky and Lisa just looked at me. The jump rope slack as a snake at our feet. But in my memory, I want these girls with fine bones and dark eyes to speak up. Those priests were not me. Those martyrs weren't you. And we have our martyr stories too. I want to take their slim girl bodies into my arms and tell them I said it only because I wanted to wear a small oval medal I could pull from my t-shirt to kiss before tests. I wanted a white communion dress and to pray with you to your beautiful Blessed Mother in blue. Actually, the Catholic Church never used animals in torture and execution. This point was clarified for me by a professor from Notre Dame. So I just want to tell you that memory is not always accurate. I'm thinking it's the musicians of Bremen and Jan Gleistein, sort of combined. You know, the slide tours that he used to do. Okay, so here's the thing. I spent every summer, my parents, often they would just stick us on a Greyhound bus and send us 3 hours back to the valley, Big Valley, this sort of place of their origins, ancestral site. My great aunt Tut, who just died at the age of 93, she was called Tut, including at her funeral, because it took so long for her to wean. Okay, that's the kind of community it is. But Tut said she said, you know, back in this valley, she said, you know, the cemetery is not that big, but everyone is buried there. You know, it's that kind of place. So I would spend a month or 6 weeks every summer there being passed around from farm to farm. And what a gift, right, to have what was really a cross-cultural experience. And so when my first book, which is mostly about that place and family stories there, was published, everyone assumed that's where I grew up. And it was even out there as a sort of official biography. And I didn't write about the area where I grew up. It took me 15 years maybe to begin to do that. And it happened in the fall of 1999 when I was able to return to the University of Pittsburgh, well, return to Western Pennsylvania and teach there for a semester. And while I was there, I got a phone call from someone at a little Catholic college, St. Vincent's College outside of Greensburg, Pennsylvania. And the person said, "You know, we think you're the only poet from Westmoreland County." And it's not true. There's a fine poet there living there now, but it was true back then. And she said, "And since you're a Westmoreland County poet, we'd like you to come read." And I just bristled, like, I'm happy to be a Mennonite poet, a woman poet, a Brooklyn poet, a Pennsylvania poet, you know, any kind of, even, I guess, an American poet, but happier to be part of this Canadian series. But to be called a Westmoreland County poet, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I so refuse to identify with this place. So between the time she called and the reading, I wrote a poem kind of explaining to myself about what it was about the place. And you need to understand, I was there in the 1970s, so there was an energy crisis, there was economic downturn, the steel industry was collapsing, organized crime, organized labor, a lot of violence, and often organized crime and organized labor were the same thing. So you might, I don't know, Jacques Yablonsky, there was a famous murder where only the dog survived. The whole family was killed and there was just the dog. And also I talk about Coke. You all are old enough to know what that is. Your kids don't know what Coke is. I mean, the fuel. So this is some sense of that place. Westmoreland. By a railroad spur and some charred coke ovens, 4 skating ponds in a row we called first pond, second pond, third pond, and fourth, never noticing those failures of imagination. Ovens still glowed like holes to hell along back roads by Hunker. Memorial Day meant nothing. Independence Day meant nothing, but Labor Day was fireworks, parades, a fireman's fair with bingo tents and boxing under lights. September's hills around Bushy Run and Brush Creek surrendered their metal for no one's work. Goldenrod and ironweed more brilliant than the bruised ore pellets we gleaned along the tracks for our slingshots. Jewelweed thrived along Stink Creek. Water rusted in ponds of runoff, and in parking lots, slag chips were flamingo feathers. The Delbane brothers rode to fires, hanging off the fire truck, their bloody butcher aprons flapping. Brides rode to their wedding receptions, clinging to that truck, veils trailing smoke tongues. Once, volunteer firemen tried to blow fog off the field for homecoming. We fought in the end zone for splinters of goalpost, the one true cross. Band members were faggots. Thespians were faggots. Brains hid in the library during activity period. At the bus stop, we spit hawkers onto one spot and kicked a snot puck on the ice. At the bus stop, Johnny Johnson said, "Blow me," and I said, "Dare it," like all the kids. But when he pulled out his little dick, I hid my eyes. Nights were train cry and rumble, fear of house fire, fear of trench-coated men opening a car trunk stuffed with Yablonsky bodies, or teamsters dropping cement blocks onto the turnpike. At the Monroeville Sheraton, men got shot. Saturday morning on the radio, sweet polkas went out for birthdays, anniversaries, first Holy Communions. Saturday afternoon at Norwin Public Library, a penis jabbed from a gap in the stacks. I slammed my books, moved to periodicals. But it was there when I got back. When I marched back and tried to stare the creep down, he was just an ordinary man, a dentist or someone's dad, standing in the shelves. Was it much worse than any place we could have grown up? Or, like all the Hawthorne they forced us to read in 11th grade, was Westmoreland County wasted on us, so young, all we could learn was to hate it? Yeah, but you can't, look, here's the thing I'm thinking, you can't remember something with so much detail without loving it, right? Yeah, that's the thing. Or loving it too, is probably better to say. So I finally graduated from NYU in 1985, which was a really interesting time to be living in New York City because there was way too much money in Manhattan because of what was going on Wall Street. At my commencement, when the business school degree was granted en masse to hundreds and hundreds of students in the park there in Washington Square, all the business students threw real money in the air. Yeah, I know, it's a different time. But I was stubborn and refused, and you could just get paid to do anything, you know, make soup or water plants or anything. But I was determined to do good, and so I taught for 1 year at St. Anthony's Commercial High School, which was this non-accredited high school that met for half a day. It was for all the girls that got kicked out of the real Catholic high schools in the city. These were girls with knives in their purses. They were such bad girls. And they did things like throw statues of saints and fight in class. And so that immediately sent me back to grad school. And you know, and again, like the not knowing how things work or the being stubborn or something, I thought, I'm not going to apply for financial aid. I'm going to pay my own way. That way, I don't have to please anyone. So I took the typing test, and I got a job working for the university typing slide labels for art history slides at an art history library, which was actually a wonderful job because I learned a lot about art history, although, you know, this big. So I did stuff like that during grad school so that my tuition was covered. And this poem, I studied with a wonderful poet named Galway Cannell, who had a rule that every week all the graduate students had to come to the seminar having memorized a poem. Every week. And then he was a very scary, powerful figure, and we would all come in and write it down dutifully, and he would get the whole sheaf of poems and rifle through them and say, all right, let's hear Yeats. And that person had to recite. So this poem has fragments of Gerard Manley Hopkins's poem, Spring and Fall. It's pretty, maybe familiar to some of you. Margaret, are you grieving over golden groves on leaving? So there are these fragments of that, along with the narrative that is a sort of reflection of what New York City was like in those days, and my life too, I suppose. And it begins with a quote from the pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty. Right before his death, he knew he was dying of cancer, and right before his death, he wrote a very short meditation about poetry that was published in Poetry magazine, and so the poem begins with a line from that meditation. Gerard Manley Hopkins on the 6 train. I would have lived more fully if I'd memorized more verse, wrote the dying Richard Rorty, pragmatist to the end, as I would have lived more fully if I'd made more close friends. Just married, 1986, typing labels for art slides, which by now must all be digitized. In the basement of the Doris Duke Mansion, 5th Avenue and 78th, I committed a poem each week, hopeful and afraid Galway Cannell would call on me to recite for the workshop. That day, Margaret, are you grieving? I raced to Lexington late, leapt down the steps as a graffitied 6 rumbled into the station. Of course, the doors before me didn't open. So I leapt to the next, slipped between their closing, and snaked through the crowd as we pulled from the platform. Only then I looked back. Empty benches, and an unmistakable continent of fresh blood on the floor of the closed car. No one spoke as we tunneled under the east side, with whatever had happened sealed up behind us. But someone must have met my eyes in irony or solidarity, as New Yorkers do. As the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder. I got out at Astor Place like any other day, climbed into clear September air, and, still rehearsing that verse, strode past the parking lot, now luxury apartments, where sidewalk vendors hawked books, clothes, housewares, heroin. Worlds of Wanwood leaf meal. This was before Giuliani cleaned up the city. Naturally, I was called to recite that night. The blight man was born for, and must have in some forgettable way. Alive, but alone now, I wonder if that poet-priest of long ago would make my story close so tightly too. It is everything, and just myself I mourn for. So that the final line there really echoes Hopkins. Right, I'm realizing it's only about 1992, and I gotta speed things up here a little. Okay, so that first book, Sleeping Preacher, has all these ethnic identifiers, and it sort of sets up this world. It creates this world of conservative Mennonites and Amish people, and in a very what feels to me now a very simple-minded way, sets up that world and the rest of the world. But you have to remember that seemed true to me. That was true to my experience growing up. There was that world in that valley and the place I was living. And then, of course, the theology of that valley didn't help me complicate my sense of things. But this poem, the first poem in this book, I'll just read it to show you literally a conversation between these two worlds. Green Market, New York. The first day of false spring, I hit the street buoyant, my coat open. I could keep walking and leave that job without cleaning my desk. At Union Square, the country people slouch by crates of last fall's potatoes. An Amish lady tends her table of pies. I ask where her farm is. Upstate, she says, but we moved from PA, where the land is better and the growing season's longer by a month. I ask where in PA. Towns you wouldn't know, around Mifflinburg, around Belleville. And I tell her I was born there. Now, who would your grandparents be? Thomas and Vesta Peachy. Well, I was a Peachy, she says, and she grins like she sees the whole farm on my face. What a place your folks had down Locust Grove. Do you know my father, the harness shop on Front Mountain Road? I do. And then we can't think what to say. The traffic, that valley so far from the traffic on Broadway. I choose a pie while she eyes my short hair, then looks square on my face. She knows I know better than to pay $6 for this. Do you live in the city? She asks, do you like it? I say no. And that was no lie, Emma Peachy. I don't like New York. But sometimes these streets hold me as hard as we're held by rich earth. I have not forgotten that Bible verse. Whoever puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. Well, you know that habit of hurling a Bible verse. But what happens there? I mean, it's one way to end an argument. What happens there is, I think, really important. And I didn't understand for a long, long time why that was the way to end the poem. I got the thing about the sort of proof texting, and whoever puts his hand to the plow and looks back, and the words of Jesus there, you know, follow your course. But the association between the pen and the plow is ancient and goes etymologically. The idea of verse, the word verse etymologically is related to the plowing of the ox in the field. And so the plow and the pen have always been connected, and the line of verse and the furrow have always been associatively linked. So sometimes intuition is the guide there. So this book, Sleeping Preacher, hit the world at the right time, at the time when there were conversations about multiculturalism, and people were genuinely interested in reading about other communities, minority communities. So that was very lucky for me. And it's still taught. It's probably, of all my books, the best-selling one, because it's taught in classes of sort of other literature. And I would say, too, cynically, that in the United States, Amish and Mennonite people are sort of favored minorities because they're European. Conservative people don't want to take your jobs. They don't want to go on public assistance. You know, all the stereotypes that get associated with racial minorities don't apply. And they have a kind of favored status legally. And so I think all of that has helped this book sort of have a life in the world far beyond me. However, when the book was published, I was so naive that I didn't think that the Mennonites back in that community would ever know about it. Because, I know, yeah. Because they're not real big readers of contemporary poetry. And I don't know, I just didn't, the world seemed so far away. I was writing these poems in Brooklyn, New York, you know, and it seemed so far. So I left everybody's names in it. All these horrible family stories from decades ago that the reason people still tell them is because they're still upsetting, right? So when the book came out, it was pretty traumatic. And I was, especially for me, because I knew my great aunts were very upset, but they couldn't talk to me about it. And I would hear about it second or third hand, and there was nothing I could do. So that's when I got interested in Joseph W. Yoder and turned all my graduate work, PhD work, into thinking about literacy and literate practices in that community. And how do people read and think about literature and truth and anything that's essentially, in some ways, anything that's in a book textual gets read as true. And if it's not true, then the author is irresponsible. You know, I mean, that's putting it pretty bluntly, but and what I learned in that work, I ended up going back into the valley and doing a lot of ethnographic interviews and talking with people who knew Yoder, and thinking long and hard about the oral tradition and oral culture and things that are retained in human memory as opposed to those things that get written down and sold and travel. And it's like Plato. I mean, all the ways that my relatives objected to this book, the reasons they gave, are like the things that Socrates said in the Phaedrus about why writing was a bad idea. Because even if you write something and it's wrong, it can't change its mind. That was one reason. Another reason is you can't change the telling of the story given the different audience. And the story travels, and we lose control of it. You know, all these things that people were saying I got in a deep way right there before my eyes, and had to respect and think about. And so the Joseph Yoder biography, what it was a dissertation, eventually became a biography, really came out of that work. And I just have a tiny little poem about oral tradition. The other thing I realized was these people, I would ask them, so what was he like, this J.W. Yoder? He was this absolutely uncharacteristic Amishman. He was loud, he was boastful, he was a flashy dresser, he was very gifted as a musician, and nobody would ever say something abstract. I would say, what was he like? And they wouldn't say what I just said to you. Or they wouldn't say what I think, which is he had no sense of cultural relativity. They would not say that. They would say, well, one year we had these army worms in the corn. And J.W. read somewhere about some sonic device that would get the worms out of the corn. And he came in and told us about it. And everybody was suspicious, and nobody followed the idea. And then he said, well, let the dumb Amishmen eat wormy corn. That's like a modernist poet, right? Who will not give you the abstraction, but will give you the image, right? Brilliant. Oral tradition. Before I leave, Percy Yoder means to give me something I can use. Your grandpa was a worker, a driver. We only saw him at market when he had a calf to sell. But his dad, I worked for him when I was young, stopped plowing well before supper time so the horses cooled down and wouldn't drink so fast back at the barn. Of the fields our ancestors cleared long before tractors, some lie bare to the sun. In others, great oaks rain shade for horses and men. Percy means to show me both kinds, so that I may choose one. So in 1996, I got the call, literally a phone call, from Paul Knisley, who grew up as a Beachy Amishman in Kansas and was running the English department at Messiah College. And when I picked up the phone in my apartment in Brooklyn, here was this man who spoke English with a faint Pennsylvania Dutch accent. It was like I was talking with one of my great uncles. And he said, we have a job for you at Messiah College, poet, somebody to run the writing center, you know, all these things. And my first thought was, how can I go any place called Messiah? Because you would go to conferences, and it would be like your name and then Messiah. But it's true. Rod tried to change that. He did. I know. And somebody stood up at the faculty meeting and said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Really. And that was a huge move. It was my first teaching job, and I was there for 4 years. And I learned so much about different kind of Christians that I had not encountered before. It was a powerful and good experience. And while there, I published Eve's Striptease, and the provost suggested I not acknowledge the college in the book. So, you know, that was how that was. But, and then in 2000, I went to Penn State. I thought it would be a good thing to go to a research university where I would have more time to write. And it has been good. It's also been bad, especially lately. And in the next decade at Penn State, I had a child. I had a divorce after a long marriage. I saw the United States change profoundly after 9/11 and get engaged in two wars that many of us found very unnecessary and hideous, and felt helpless to stop. My first book of poems was 92, then 98, and then 2011. So you see a pattern there. It's 6 years between the first two and 13. I don't know when the next, you can do the math, when the next one will come. And in this last book, I was thinking of it as a book about poetry. Where does poetry erupt in times of violence and difficulty? Where are those moments of truth and beauty bursting through? And maybe especially in difficult times, we need articulations of truth and beauty. And sometimes, of course, beauty being truth. And so I thought it was about poetry. But then when I put the book together, I realized it was also a lot about labor, about work, which of course takes us back to the knees that work. And I think what I'll do is just conclude by reading a couple of poems from that new book, and then we can have a conversation, if you're still here. The title poem takes a certain amount of energy to read. You see, it's very prose-like. See how long the lines are? It's like Whitman almost, except not as crazy as Whitman, probably. And I understand you have these big chain bookstores like we do. They're called Chapters? Okay, so imagine Chapters. It's called Barnes & Noble in the United States, but you get the idea. Poetry in America. The Barnes & Noble in Evansville, Indiana, mostly sells coffee. Though the manager said 10 or 12 showed up once for a local author. One, besides my friend Laura, came for me. I thought of priests who must pronounce the full Eucharist, even if no one goes to Mass. Thought Virginia Woolf and Oscar Wilde looked kind of pained as Barnes & Noble posters. And facing 15 empty folding chairs, I suggested we all just go downstairs for coffee. I was hopeful. I hate bookstore readings, which pay nothing but constant interruptions. Customer service on line 8. Does one keep reading in that case or pause to incorporate the line into her poem? No way, I came to hear poetry, said a woman in walking shorts and sandals with socks. I'm a poet too, can't help the disease. It's either write or go mad. She had bangs and plastic glasses like Ramona the Pest. I'm Barbara, don't write much now. Too busy working and labor organizing at the Whirlpool plant. Come from Henderson, Kentucky, over the river. You hear of a white person committing a crime in Henderson? That would be my relative. But let's get going. I've got things to do yet tonight. So I got going. Sometimes Barbara moaned as if she tasted something delicious or cried, Hey, that was a good one. People walking by eyed us the way they look at preachers in bus stations. A woman and little girl sat in back. The mom held a book about women who love too much in front of her face like a mask. The girl imitated with the Madeline storybook, but sometimes she peeked at me, and they stayed almost to the end. Barbara took my book from the stack, waiting to be returned. Wouldn't buy it if I didn't like the work, she said as I signed, then walked out with us. You know, it's still 73 cents to the dollar. No matter how much education you have, you're working harder and making less than a white man. For women of color, it's worse. And now all we get is backlash. Well, I'm a 50-year-old woman, and they can kiss my ass. That spring, Barbara had fasted for 19 days at the gates of the governor's mansion because he'd turned Kentucky's community colleges into trade schools. Do you know what that means? She jabbed me with her bird eyes. No history, no political science, no literature, no going on for a college degree like I did, and you watch. It's coming to other states. Evil bastards will call it job training, but it's just one more way to keep poor people down. Outside, light mist drifted onto cars in the parking lot, softening neon signs down the strip. Take care of yourself. She waved a blessing. Where the hell is your umbrella? So, Barbara, there is a poet putting her body out there, using her words. The baby screaming in the back seat screams because she cannot see her mother driving, because it is night, and every night she screams before sleep, because she knows our poultry fires mean nothing next to the tigers that creep from dark trees. Screams because we will drop bombs for peace. Screams because a mother in Mexico sewed this pink sleeper while her own baby slept in a heap of clean scraps at her feet. Screams because the car drinks gas like tea. Screams as if she already sees the griefs her life will gather. Screams as the stubborn symphony keeps getting louder. Screams when it snaps off, and the car drifts into a lot, and the mother climbs beside that miserable traveler strapped in her seat, offers a breast, then slips back to the front, an arm reaching back to cup the head still hot from screaming. The mother drives, reciting the details from the night this child was born. Snow blew across the moon. Ski runs blazed like great snakes on the ridge outside our room. And still the baby screams because she can't believe anyone is driving this machine. Let's see here. This poem has some dashes, long dashes in it. They're standing in for words that aren't said. So I'll just go like this. And it is about a student I had who was a veteran of, remember that other war in the Gulf in the early 90s? Okay, so I had a veteran in my class about 10 years ago. Elegy against 10 years later. I can't say his name, but I still see his poem on a sheet of paper trembling in his fingers until he spread and pressed them onto the table in that small room of bad light and bad air in a place called the Cathedral of Learning. Other students complained. Not his words, but the ferocity of his voice, how his face suddenly shone with sweat when he spoke. That fall, I encouraged them all to write their sadness or their happiness. I didn't try to complicate their language or smarten up their ideas. That fall, everything seemed simple and stupid. I bought spent asters from buckets on the street and walked aimlessly on rare days of blue, lucid sky like the skies in Oklahoma, where he grew up dodging belt buckles, poor enough to enlist before Kuwait. His name lost, but not the poem where he sits with an officer in an open jeep somewhere in the desert as the officer gripes about his wife, then pulls out a pistol and shoots at a camel lumbering by. When I read the news, I imagined him bloody in a clawfoot bathtub back home. Surely, in poor Oklahoma, the tubs are ordinary. But how could a plain tub hold his body? I want the graceful curve, white and smooth and cool and tender against his large, hard shoulders. He said he promised the Army never to speak of. I didn't know what to believe. There in my office, I just tried to encourage him to write as if Dan, was it Dan or Dave? How do you guys get such excellent posture? I once asked him. They train you not to feel pain, he said, gazing straight into my eyes. So I think I'll read two more. There are a few poems of lament in this book. Muriel Rukeyser was a wonderful poet of the 20th century and an activist who said, around the time of World War II, she said, Americans fear poetry because they fear feeling, and that the work of poetry is to help us feel. Here's a poem in the form of a letter to my father, who was employed for many years by a large American corporation that collapsed about 12 years ago or so. Letter to Dad from New Danville, Pennsylvania. When I can no longer stand to read or write in any chair or couch in the house, I bank the fire and head out into the night, slither between electric fence lines, and climb a ridge where you can see lights from Lancaster City all the way to the Black Susquehanna. I lie down there under Orion's belt until snow melts through my hair to the back of my neck. This is the best thing you ever taught me, to stop and stretch out under tree limbs or clouds. I almost forgot how good a pasture feels beneath a sore back. And these evil days, when you can't say who will sign your check or for how long, as friends of 30 years get canned or quit or just turn silent, you must walk out onto that smooth swath of Westinghouse lawn and lie down. Think how the sky will open above you. Think how the ground will hold you, as it always has, as it certainly will, until it takes you once and for all. You know what? I think that would be a good place to end.